Hello, everybody. My name is Lawrence from the Atheist Community of Milwaukee, and we are kind of actually changing that to just Milwaukee Atheists. On the YouTube channel, we have it as Milwaukee Atheists, and we just recently changed our Facebook page from Atheist Community of Milwaukee to Milwaukee Atheists, just to keep it all the same and make sure everyone knows that we're the same entity. I don't want there to be any confusion, so we decided to put those together. But anyways, today we have in what I call a pirate historian coming in. And we're gonna talk about pirate history. We're gonna talk about myths and his upcoming books, his upcoming writings. So this is a little different from all the other stuff that we normally do on this channel, because normally we talk about secularism and science, and we have people like Richard Carrier and Aaron Ra and David Fitzgerald. We have those kinds of guys on to talk about what's going on in the secular world, I guess. So this one's going to be a bit different. It's going to be less about faith and religion and science stuff. It's going to be more about straight up history. So our guest today is Benerson Little. Do you go by Ben?
Yeah, Ben is fine.
Ben is fine.
Benerson if you need it, but and my close family calls me by my middle name Kyle too. So any of the names.
All right. I think I will just go with Ben. Ben is the author of, I think, 5 books on.
Yeah, that's correct. 5 books on piracy and 1 novel. So.
All right. And the first book of yours I read was actually your newest one, Golden Age of Piracy, The Truth Behind Pirate Myths. Mm-hmm. And for my audience that doesn't know, I am kind of obsessed with pirates right now. I mean, on my shelf right now, I'm looking at my bookshelf, and I have like 50 books on pirate history. And I spent way too much money on all these, I'll be honest. And this all started for me, and if you saw my talk on the Golden Age of Piracy, you might know this. But for me, this obsession with pirates actually started when I was coming back from Florida. I'd always liked pirates, they were always entertaining, and I liked to wear all the pirate costumes and go arg, But I read The Republic of Pirates on my way back to Milwaukee from Florida, and I absolutely loved it, and it got me on a total pirate kick. So I have books by a bunch of different authors about a bunch of different time periods in history, all about pirates and maritime history. So I've been absolutely fascinated with the subject, and that's at least how I got into this. What about you, Ben? What was the thing that got you interested in pirates?
I'm not sure there was one single thing. I was born in Key West, actually. My father was in the Navy, stationed there for several years. So I have these deep memories. We were always living by the coast anyway. I'm pretty sure I saw old black and white film. They have vague recollections of old pirate movies seen on TV and sword fighting. I was always into that. I remember a Disney comic book with Mickey Mouse playing Lieutenant Maynard, attacking Blackbeard. A lot of little things like that. Like I said, we were always by the sea. I think as long as I have any memory, I've known what a pirate ship was and sword fighting and stuff. But I moved. For a year, we moved to South Alabama. My family is from the Deep South, but my father joined the Navy to get out, basically, and my mother married him, I think, in part to get away from the South when she was young. So we spent a lot of time on the West Coast as well, traveling a lot. But my father, he did a couple of tours with Combat Camera in Vietnam, and then he was stationed aboard the USS Constellation, and this was at the height of the Vietnam War. When they were extending cruises for bombing missions off North Vietnam, and my father figured it was going to be an extended deployment. So he thought it would be a good idea if my brother and I moved back to Greenville, Alabama, South Alabama, for about a year while he was away at sea, and it would be good for us to spend some time with family. And in a way, it was wonderful. My grandparents lived on 40 acres that my father had bought for them. Um, you know, and but it was also in many ways a culture shock for me because I really hadn't grown up in the South. I'd lived in Japan for 2 years. We had traveled a lot, and so I kind of retreated into that 40 acres and a lot of my own readings and writings. I remember finding X. Mellon's book in the library there, reading it. But I had an aunt who gave me a copy of Treasure Island. She had bought it at a grocery store, and I fell in love with the book. It was an annotated copy, and today I know that all the annotations weren't correct, but that doesn't matter. It kind of not only I had this wonderful story um, associated with many things I was familiar with, but it also explained a lot of the technical details in the background, and kind of like Moby Dick on a very, very small scale. Um, at that point, I really got interested in pirates. A few years later, I guess I was about 13 at a school book sale. Found a copy of Captain Blood by Raphael Sabatini. He's one of the the great adventure romance historian writers. I've actually in routine contact, very close friend of mine is his principal modern biographer. But I read that book, fell in love with it, and after that, I kind of wanted to really get into the background and figure out what we really liked. And I started anywhere I could pick up journals, like William Dampier and Woodes Rogers. I started reading those in my teens and started collecting all of his books. After college, I went in the Navy. I was a naval officer, Navy SEAL for about 7 or 8 years actually in the Navy. And at some point there, I'd always wanted to write, but I was more interested in fiction. But I realized that a lot of what we did in SEAL team was very similar tactically to what especially the late 17th century Buccaneers were doing. And basically at that point, some years later, I started realizing nobody had actually written the book I'd been looking for, which was how did pirates sail their ships, use their weapons, actually attack, do all this detail. And I realized that I had a lot of research on it, so I continued my research, sent a book proposal out to a few publishers, and got some bites and got the first book published.
And that book is called Sea Rover's Practice, right?
That's it. Yeah.
Yep, I actually picked that one up too recently. And once I get to that time period, because right now we're actually working on a series. It's going to be the complete history of piracy. Like, I mean, complete. Like, I mean, we're going back to the sea peoples, and then we're going to modern day piracy. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's a
No.
huge undertaking. So once I get to that period of time, your book is definitely on the list.
Well, take a look at pirate hunting too. I think it was what was that my? It was either third or fourth book. I'm not sure which one of those two. I had two that came out very close together, but pirate hunting is actually a look at piracy from the viewpoint of its victims and from pirate hunters, going back to antiquity, even with some speculation on prehistory as well, bringing it all the way up to the present. It's
Oh, awesome. 'Cause
fairly. It's if you look at it's basically a history of piracy and a history of maritime development because they really developed together hand in hand. And I would strongly suspect that as soon as whatever hominid ancestor first took to sea, and right now it was probably they assumed it was a long, long time ago. You probably had people stealing too. I have never been from each other at or from the sea. I've never been one of the I'm not philosophically inclined to believe that somehow humans lived in this utopian state, before the rise of agriculture and cities and things like that.
right,
I mean,
definitely no way.
studies from chimpanzees and things show that they make war on each other. Call me a cynic, but I'm an optimist and I truly believe in humanity and treating people well. But I've met plenty of what's the language, Barry, on this? Let's just say I've met plenty of people that deserve the expletives used to describe them. So, and I'm pretty sure people were stealing from each other on the water, hundreds of thousands of years ago.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, pretty much just as soon as we could set sail, that's pretty much just as soon as piracy probably began.
I think that's exactly correct.
Yeah. So I was actually gonna get into that. I mean, most of your stuff is about the Golden Age. I was actually gonna ask how much delving you do into either modern piracy or like medieval pirates, or even before that, like in antiquity, like you were talking about.
Yeah, I touched on the entire spectrum. It's one of the reasons I wanted to write that book, was because I didn't think there was enough. Um, we tend to look at piracy as a bunch of cool guys sailing and stealing on it, but it's really, if you're looking at it from the point of view of people who are being affected by piracy, you've got a very, very different point of view. And a lot of the writing I do is in part constructive exercise or excuse for me to look at history myself and force myself to go to primary sources, and it's not just about writing a book, but I'm actually writing. I'm often rethinking things. I know a lot of writers don't do that, or at least they pretend to plot everything out, do all the research, and then if writing is just kind of an end product of it. For me, I'm actually still thinking and revising and relearning and during the actual writing process. But for a lot of what I do in all these books is simply to answer questions that I have myself, and that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, because I figured, I've been looking at piracy, what we call the Golden Age of Piracy. I can't remember who suggested it, probably a scholar some years ago. It's really a small silver age of piracy. If you go back through that, back in antiquity, the Middle Ages, piracy was huge, and there's a lot of overlap there because you didn't really necessarily have distinct navies, and there's a lot of overlap between piracy, privateering, and naval episodes. If you go back to antiquity, I tend to use the term sea roving because it's a little bit more accurate. It covers the profit at sea, basically, the use of force of arms or violence for profit at sea. And that's been around forever. It's extensive, and it was on a much, much larger scale than you saw basically of the piracy that originated in the Caribbean in the late 17th, early 18th century. That is just an extraordinarily small scale compared to some of the things in antiquity. And to be honest, even some of the Chinese pirates in the 19th century.
Yeah, the Chinese pirates, that
was
was...
scale. So, but we like these guys in the late 17th and especially the early 18th century because it's, to be honest, they're Anglo-American. They're, a lot of them operated on the North American coast, so we've kind of adopted them. We've got this mythology about them that people are kind of adhering to, clinging to, although, to be honest, tactically, and again, in many ways, I'm primarily a military historian, naval historian. Tactically, early 18th century, these guys weren't very impressive at all. They were largely attacking merchantmen. I know you'll read articles that say that, they even turned everything on the head where naval warships became prey. That is not true. These guys mostly fled from naval warships. But if you go back a generation or two in the late 17th century, these were some very brutal men. If you read accounts of the sack of Spanish towns from the Spanish point of view, it's just horrific. If I were a Spaniard, I would have outfitted a vessel and hunted these guys down and given them no quarter. But looked at from a military or a tactical perspective, it was actually quite impressive for what they were capable to do. Expeditions of 1,000 or more men, many ships, sacking major cities. So I've tended to be drawn more toward the late 17th century than I have to the early 18th century, again, in part because of my background. It's a much richer period when it comes to both tactics at sea and shore. I'm sorry. I'm sure I had an answer in there somewhere to the question.
No. That was definitely there's definitely an answer there. But I'm glad you went off on that. That was really interesting. Yeah. Why do you think when we talk about the Golden Age of Piracy, we're talking about that little sliver of time? I know you said that it was they're kind of nearby, and they're pretty much a bunch of white people. So. Was there anything about that age that really stood out among other periods of piracy?
Let me give you a really short answer to the white people thing, and then go into that the main question there. A lot of the early 18th century pirates were probably predominantly white, but they weren't entirely white. But I think we tend to, they fit well into that cultural norm we have of essentially white American history.
Right.
But especially if you look late 17th century, you had all nationalities involved, especially late 17th century, but you still had this in early 18th century. And you had all the local cultures. You had black people, brown people, white people involved. These were not free-thinking anti-slavery utopias. Pirates were slavers primarily. They did have some free men of color in their ranks, but it was not uncommon for them to seize free people in a town that they raided and sell them as slaves, for example. And if you look at Spanish pirates during this period, they are literally about equal parts whites, blacks, Native Americans, and mixed race peoples. It's actually, if you are looking for multicultural pirates, you need to look at Spanish pirates at this period. And now I have to make an apology because when I drift off in one area, I forget the bigger question, which was.
Actually, before you get into that, I do want to clarify something. Maybe something I said. Like when I said that it was a bunch of white guys, what I meant was that's our perception.
Yeah, I understood.
Okay.
I don't
I just.
think. Oh no, not to worry. That was. I figured you were just kind of ripping off my sarcastic statement about so a bunch of white guys. That's one of the reasons we like it. Now I actually do remember your question now. There are two books: Alexander Esquimelling's Buccaneers of America and Charles Johnson, whoever he was. That was a pseudonym, and there are debates back and forth on who he was.
Right,
but to me, it doesn't really matter. Those two books basically incredibly popularized what was an actual problem at the time. Anyway, people were aware of pirates; they were aware of the depredations. So it was a significant part of history. But these books really popularized it a lot in the public eye. And it's just kept, these books probably have been constantly in print since they were originally published. And it's kept in the public eye. They're very romantic figures in a lot of ways. It's like everything we look at, you can take a sliver here, a sliver there, and take the good parts and romanticize it and forget about the bad parts. But just because there's a sense of rebellion associated with these, a sense of, being bandits and committing these great grand crimes, and many of them getting rich off it or escaping from it. All of this, I think, has helped keep it in the public eye. And they're very suitable subjects for myth and internet memes and popular cinema and all kinds of things. But those two books are probably where we got a large start. It really made these guys stand out. Plus, especially in history of the Americas, recent history, North American, U.S. history is not that old. I was in Denmark a few years ago in Nykøbing, and the gentleman who works at the medieval center there, who runs it, was saying, yes, he said, I think, and if you're Danish and I get this wrong, I apologize. I think he said Nykøbing was founded maybe in 1100 AD. He said, yes, it's a very young city. That is an ancient Native American town by, North American standards. So we're more interested in our recent history, especially as it applies to us. You can take a look at pirates, and that's really not that long ago, and it's been incorporated into our literature and everything else. And I don't think we don't really have that medieval Mediterranean ancient history in the U.S. And I think people have seized on this period as well. And like I said, it's local history. A lot of the even, to be honest, a great deal of this history, especially late 17th century Buccaneers, and even some of the French pirates in the 18th century, your average American reader of piracy is completely unfamiliar with it. Esquimelling had multiple editions of his book. The French edition contains a lot of material that is not in the English editions. There was some very famous Dutch and French filibusters, Buccaneers, late 17th century, that a lot of people are completely unfamiliar with. Their depredations easily equal any of the English-derived pirates during this period. That people are largely unaware of them, and a part of that is kind of cultural and historical. We like the English guys, we like the American, the guys who were kind of like Americans. In spite of the fact that this is a multicultural country, which we have immigrants for the past few centuries from all around the world. I'm not trying to pick on this and make necessarily a political statement here and say that, but a lot of the history, if you grew up reading history books, is it's very white centered. We tend to not talk about slavery too much. I know people who've been upset to the small way at some of my books when I'm pointing out that pirates were slavers, for example, because that doesn't really fit in the idea that they
Yeah,
have.
yeah, it doesn't really fit the
Disney,
narrative.
Disney came out and said, that Jack Sparrow, he's anti-slavery. Well, that's nonsense. If you look at it from the story, it's a fantasy. But I'm dealing with that in the sequel to that novel I'm writing right now, because these guys end up in the Caribbean. You've got to deal with the slavery question. You've got to do it honestly, but you can't make your leading character look like we don't like slavers, for obvious reasons.
Right, yeah.
You don't want to diminish that leading character by
presuming that they like slavery.
So you've got to draw that line between, he's necessarily involved in it because he's a late 17th century privateer in the Caribbean, but he's, kind of morally opposed. And you can draw a lot of conflict out of that. But most of the writers, Raphael Sabatini, he doesn't really delve too heavily into slavery for the simple reason that it probably offend a lot of readers. Even a century ago when he was writing his books. It may not have offended a lot of readers too, but it's a subject that a lot of these writers, novelists, have tended to avoid. Or they do the opposite, like what's the Assassin's Creed Black Flag game does, and same thing Disney has taken. These guys are anti-slavery. We're going to go free the slaves and make the world a better place. But historically, it's very inaccurate.
Right. There are a lot of our perception of pirates has just been so diluted in myths because of things like Treasure Island, Captain Blood, Seahawk, just a bunch of books that have created this super romantic image of pirates. Now, I'm not against romanticizing the past completely, as long as we don't forget the history. Like, I'm not against looking at pirates under some sort of pretty lens, but as long as we don't forget who they actually were.
I think that's a very, very good point. That's exactly how I feel about it. But a lot of people, they actually absorb the myth, and for them the myth is the reality. And I don't know. I don't have a problem by holding on to two completely different opposing ideas in my head at the same time. I can understand both. I understand how they get there, and I reread Captain Blood by Raphael Sabatini once a year. I enjoy it, but I could nitpick it to death if I wanted to. I don't. I'm not going to because it'll ruin it. I understand the reality behind it. It doesn't stop me from enjoying the book, but I know some people seem to have a more difficult time doing that. It's that, laying facts out in front of them, they think you're trying to spoil everything.
Yeah, so I was actually, before you called, I was just looking through your recent book, and it got me thinking, there are so many myths, so many misattributions, some of which are completely fabricated, others of which are, based on a grain of truth. What do you think is the most, the thing that has been mythicized, I guess, the thing that's been drowned in myths so much? I don't know if my question is clear there.
It is. It's clear. Yeah, it's very clear. I don't know. There's so many myths that dominate, but probably I'd have to go with the buried treasure myth. And honestly, every year or two, I get an email in depth about somebody who just knows there's local pirate treasure and can I help them with it? Or literally, I had somebody who said that he had a friend and they're trying to re-find the cave and they discovered Captain Kidd's treasure. This was not in the U.S., so don't go out and get your shovels and start digging. And you have to explain that not only is there almost zero likelihood of buried treasure, but that there is no way that even if there were, that you're going to find any buried treasure where you think you have. And you can't talk these people out of it. They are true believers. It's their ship has come in and they're going to be rich, and you can't, so you just give them the information, and then they're kind of like, oh, I'm sorry to hear that, but I think it's still there, or, well, I disagree, I'll show you, or whatever. But, you have to give them honest answers. And it's just not there. One of the problems is that people don't understand how pirates during this period operated when it came to plunder. Some few years ago, there was a I don't know if it was Forbes magazine, one of the big business magazines, did an article on the richest pirates, which was nonsense. It didn't understand even how pirates work. Your average pirate captain in the late 17th century, and even in the early 18th century, got 2 shares. So, let's say you had 75 crew and you had a few shares that were going to go for disability and a few shares for, provisioning, maintaining the vessel.
Yeah, didn't they pay for like body parts too? Like if you
Yeah,
lost something?
all that disability and everything was taken out first, and then out of, let's say there were whatever shares were left, it was divided up, 1 share per crew, but occasionally there were minor variations, and 2 shares for the captain. And that's it. So the captains weren't getting wealthy necessarily off it anyway. They only had twice as much as their crew did. Second, they tended to share this money immediately. Now, make the share distributions, and the quartermaster would keep detailed records of this. Sometimes the money was all kept together, like in a central part of the vessel, but any crewman could take his share out anytime he wanted. He might not want, because in spite of articles against it, people do steal. I've got actually an account of pirates trying to steal from each other and even beating each other up, and trying to take the few pieces of eight that they had. It wasn't even a lot of money, and these guys actually did bury some of the sand, but it was just for a day or two to keep their buddies from stealing. But anyway, you weren't going to go out and bury that money anyway. There was absolutely no reason to do it. I will make a mild digression on this, because I know there's some economists and others who have argued, often from a Marxist point of view, about the egalitarian nature of pirates, including in sharing everything. It doesn't really apply to the late 17th century. While every man would generally have a share, boys maybe half a share, and a captain 2 shares, and we're talking the Caribbean here, captains in the late 17th century, more often than not, ended up owning their vessels. Because essentially, if you started out, you like the captain, you had a small vessel, you had another capture, it was a better vessel. They'd move to that, where the crew who wanted to go with the captain went to that vessel, and that captain basically obtained ownership of that vessel, at which point he could negotiate with the crew for the number of shares to support that vessel, to maintain it. So, and this could range anywhere from 2 shares for a small vessel, 10 to 12 seems about average for medium-sized vessels, to on the rare, large 300, 400-ton vessels, maybe as many as 30 to 40 shares. Now, you follow me on this. If you have a long, unprofitable cruise, well, that 40 shares, because there's not much money, might not even maintain the vessel for provisioning and things like that. But if you have a profitable cruise, guess what? That 10, 30, 40 shares, only a small amount of that is necessary to maintain the vessel. The rest of it went in the captain's pocket. And a lot of these captains grew quite wealthy. Lawrence de Graaf ended up marrying, not only growing wealthy this way, but married a very wealthy widow as well, had a huge plantation, I think 100 or more slaves on it in Saint Domingue. You don't really see this in the early 18th century, though. And I think that's one of the reasons the pirates in the early 18th century are more appealing to some of the Marxist ideologies, things like that. There's less of that capitalistic economic ideas involved there. But anyway, getting back to buried treasure, you're not going to, if you've just been on a cruise and you've got these shares, why would you go bury the treasure somewhere for somebody else to find, or some of your crew to run away with and steal? I mean, it makes absolutely no sense. And the only reason the myth survives is because we all want to find that buried treasure. And people did actually bury treasure in times of war. I mean, the American Civil War, people would bury their coins and things out, in the field somewhere behind their house. People still occasionally find that stuff. It's been around for a century or more. I know in India, in the 17th, 18th century, it was quite common as zombies came through for people to bury their wealth, in ponds or in the ground in large trunks. So it wasn't that people didn't bury their wealth, but it really wasn't pirates doing this, because they didn't have any idea. But it probably Captain Kidd's story of him basically giving some valuables to was it John Gardner on Gardner's Island, saying,
Yeah.
"Hey, basically hang on to these for a few days, because I might need this money to defend myself, because they're accusing me of piracy." And as soon as the government heard about that, they went and seized it all back. And one person said he heard it was buried on the island, so suddenly everybody's looking for buried treasure, and then it's entered our mythology. I mean, there was a gentleman named Clement Downing, who early 18th century with the East India Company met a former member of Blackbeard's crew, who And he said the guy was telling him a tall tale, basically, of, yeah, we got buried treasure, and he told him where it was. And I know people will say, but there you go, there's proof. Well, nobody's going to tell you where, if they, trust me, if somebody has a treasure map, they're not going to tell you where.
Yeah, yeah. That's another thing. Treasure maps. Uh, I mean, I haven't read all these 50 pirate books. I've read maybe like 7 of them, but because it's a huge haul. But in those readings, I have not seen anything on treasure maps. Where is there?
That's probably Robert Louis Stevenson, and he was
Straight from there.
Yeah, and I go over it. I know some other authors as well about his influences from a number of other authors who'd actually written stories. And there was also treasure mania in the 19th century, with people claiming to have treasure maps and all kinds of stuff. And I think Stevenson and Poe too, and Stevenson was influenced by Edgar Allan Poe, just kind of picked up on all this stuff and kind of started doing riffs on it. But if you want a real treasure map, I think I pointed this out in one of my books, it would have been a chart showing a sunken Spanish vessel. And something a lot of people don't quite realize is that a lot of pirates, and especially late 17th century, they didn't have anything better to do. They would raid the Florida coast for Native American divers and go hit the Spanish wrecks, and bring up silver. And they'd even run the Spanish off the wrecks until eventually governments got involved and decided they were going to profit from it, not let these, this Caribbean pirate trash profit off of it. But if you want a treasure map, it would have been a chart marking where some of these Spanish wrecks were, I think. That's opposed to a real treasure map, pirate treasure map, so to speak, that you would find. And pirates actually did what they called fish for silver on them, along with anybody else who could. After real, late 17th century, a lot of the buccaneers drifted in and out from different trades depending on what was going on at the time. They might be cutting wagyu one year, they might be fishing silver for a few months, they might work on a turtle sloop or a local smuggling sloop, and they might join a voyage, go raid the Spanish again. And I'm sure that if somebody ever actually finds a small bit of buried pirate treasure one day, they'll pull it up and say, here's proof that all pirates buried the treasure. It's really the exception to prove the rule.
Yeah, exactly. Although that would be pretty awesome. Somebody.
It would be wonder. I mean, I haven't stopped hoping that I'll trip over. When I was a kid and I was 40 acres in Alabama, trust me, I was looking for buried treasure. I didn't find it. I found, cattle skulls, and we found an old whiskey still one time and things like that. But didn't find any pot of coins. It's kind of like Tom Sawyer when Mark Twain said he would have been happy with a few, silver coins or something instead of the big treasure that he found. There's another book that in some ways may have influenced me, by the way. Not just treasure, I was reading Tom Sawyer because they went out to fight pirates. And, there were caves and hidden treasures and things there too. It's just, we have an incredibly vast, wide-ranging sorts of influences that have been touched on by piracy, which is a lot about what the next book that I'm working on right now. I've got a couple chapters written, and I'm about to send a proposal off to my agent. It's just that whole, not trying to go the traditional way, which I've done somewhat already, debunking pirate myths, but actually looking at the connections between the myths and the present, and also looking at a broader, kind of in parallel of how our minds work and our culture work. There's a lot of fake news has always been around. We're inundated by it right now, but as a microcosm, you could look at the study of piracy and the history and how our culture has absorbed a lot of truths, but even more myths, and how people will cling very much to these myths. It's kind of a random, almost manic book in a way, but that's an area I've always been interested in, is just how we get to where we are from where we came from and where this may take us in the future. And because I've done so much research on piracy, it's easy for me to make all these modern connections and say, look, if this little tiny event didn't happen 300 years ago, you wouldn't have A, B, C, D, E, and F, and think about how our culture might be different.
Yeah, good old butterfly effect.
Yeah.
Yeah. And actually, I was gonna see if you could talk about that a little bit. The new book that you're writing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What's that? What's that gonna be?
Basically, what I was saying, broadly speaking, subtitled, it's Riffs, Rants, and Reflections on Pirate History and Modern Culture. But I'm essentially looking at 3 things. The central theme is I'm looking back and trying to find out the real origins of the pirates who inspired Captain Blood. Dr. Henry Pittman was sentenced as a rebel convict to Barbados. He escaped. Raphael Sabatini, 200 years or so later, reads this account. He's inspired to write Captain Blood, and we go off from there. But we don't really know much about. He did meet some actual pirates. We don't know who they were. He kept their names private, probably because by this time they were in the mid to late 1680s. They were prosecuting pirates. They were trying to suppress buccaneering, and they were prosecuting people. So this guy didn't want his name to be held out. So ostensibly, we're trying to find out who this guy is. Okay, but that central path is letting me deviate and riff on everything from politics to law to pop culture and everything else. So through about 15 to 20 chapters, I'm just as I bring history in, I'm literally in modern Hollywood cinema, the way Hollywood looks at things. Essentially, I'm taking all the odds and ends of all this research I've done and showing how several things that we think we're different, that we're modern. We're really not. People function the same way today they did 2 centuries ago. I know we have the internet. That's just more information that people are abusing. But functionally, I've never believed that humans are any different now than they were 1,000 years ago. And I can hear the cultural anthropologists screaming right now, but they're the same people that say that there's only 2 or 3 universals in human culture anyway, which I find. I've traveled the world around, and I find people pretty much the same wherever you go. They're modified by culture to some degree, but I haven't found anybody I can't get along with.
Yeah,
but anyway, I want to take. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna actually agree with you about how humans by nature are. That humans haven't really changed all that much. Definitely not in the past 1,000 years. Like we just, like you said, we have just more information to work with now. We're using our skills differently, but we still have the same basic outlook. We're still trying to accomplish the same general things.
Yeah, I think that's why classic literature remains appealing, because people are no different. It doesn't matter what culture created literature.
Yeah, and I think that's a part of the reason why George Carlin's comedy is so timeless. Just nothing's changed.
Yeah, and I keep saying that nothing has changed. And we all think that latest, people pick on millennials. Well, people were picking on my generation. I read something recently that was picking on millennials. It says millennials want a strong military, but nobody wants to join the military. Well, to be honest, nobody in my generation was really joining the military either. And during Vietnam, there was the draft. And during World War II, the great, patriotic war, there was the draft. Okay, if you had enough volunteers, you wouldn't have a draft. So we pick on every generation, going back thousands of years, but that still manages. Part of them grow up to screw things up, and part of them grow up to try to fix things. So I haven't seen any significant difference.
All right, so you would say that the next book then is kind of like a sequel to your last one?
Sort of, in a way. It's really, the riffs, rants, and reflections part really, I hate saying reflects, but that actually shows very much what the book is. I'm really just not just looking at how pirate culture is, not simply that, we have Johnny Depp because of such and such 3 centuries ago, but want to use it as an example of how history is misinterpreted and reinterpreted and can be used and abused. Because for me, it is a perfect example. It's very simple. Everybody's familiar with it. And from here, I can say, point out that the same process that we get things right and wrong about pirate history, and the same process that, and we're not even aware of it, that some of the ways we look at things actually come from these small events in the past, that applies to history across the board. And so really what I'm trying to do with the book is do it essentially on 2 levels. And the central theme of it, of course, is, hey, who are these pirate guys and that inspired Captain Blood? But the real book is about culture, and it's hopefully it'll be timely considering the mess everything is in right now. And I know that's understandable mess we're in. There's just massive information. And anytime you have, I know when the Gutenberg press came along and people started publishing books, you immediately see the same things we started doing with the internet, pornography, propaganda, not just the good things that come from the written word. If there's any difference or change, something that I've noted, and this is another thing I want to point the book at, as is that people need to read more. They need to be better educated.
I
They should not
100% agree with
accept
you.
things at face value. They need to question everything. I'm tired of seeing Facebook pages or internet pages about an expert that says he's he does this and he does that. But when you actually look for a resume or CV, which actually point to things, it's not there, but people accept it as face value because this guy talks loudly and says, I'm an expert and I'm world renowned and and I had this experience and that, but then he doesn't actually list the experience. But people will accept that, and you shouldn't. I tell, kids when I start going to college, it's okay to challenge your professors. I mean, when you read my books, and you should look at the footnotes and say, does he actually document this? I found in Piracy several books in small but critical areas, the citations don't actually support the argument. But everybody assumes that because 99% of the book is, well documented and accurate, that 1% is also documented, and it's not in many cases. You tend to find this more, just like you do in politics. The more ideological the argument is, the more likely you're going to see this. Same thing in politics. The best political liars I've ever seen were the ones that tell the truth 99% of the time. They just slip that big lie in there in the 1%, and everybody misses it because they assume this is for politicians, relatively honest individuals, so everything must be true.
Yeah, I mean,
question everything. There's nothing wrong with that, and no one should be offended by that. And I'm sorry, I interrupted, but if somebody is offended by the fact that you are legitimately questioning, I'm not talking about being a jerk. There's plenty of those around, but somebody brings a legitimate question about your research, your citations. I'm not talking about ad hominem attacks or something because you just don't like this individual.
yeah, just like when someone says something like, "Oh my God, are you like really questioning this?" Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, when somebody does that, it's nobody should ever be offended by that. It's just like, well, the citation's there, you can go look it up for yourself, and that should be a sufficient answer. But I've seen people who their answer to everything is that, well, the argument doesn't really pan out, and you ask them, well, can you please show me how that argument, because I don't see your argument. You're not giving me an argument right now. You're just expecting me to take this at face value based on your word. And, nobody should ever be offended by the fact that somebody has a legitimate question about the research.
Yeah, I completely agree.
It's like, hey, can you send me this source? And I'm like, here. Or, somebody said, you made this argument and I only see one citation, one document supporting it. And I'm like, oh, well, yeah, I know. Here's a couple more. I put the footnote and notes down because I didn't want to scare the average reader off. I go, here's a couple more. And if you read through the book, you'll find a couple more citations in support of this. But nobody should be offended by doing that.
Yeah, there are some books that I've been reading that I hear something crazy and I'm like, okay, what's the source for this? For example, I just finished reading The Pirate Hunter, Richard Sachs.
Yeah.
And somewhere in the middle of it, he talks about how they landed was on the Nicobar Islands, and they met up with, or they saw men with tails, like they called them monkey men. And I'm like, okay, what's the source for this? Where are you getting monkey men? So I mean, he didn't like cite that anywhere in the book, or he may have. I forget if he has like citations by like section or if he just has like a full reference thing in the back. I forget, but I had to look that up because I was like, okay, where is he getting this from? And one of the main sources for, like, when I look online, one of the main sources for that is the book, is Zach's book. So it took me a while to actually find where he got that from, but eventually I got there. But it was a haul.
There's an unfortunate tendency in publishing is that you may have a great book, but if you can't, and I don't want to give specific examples here, in part because I'm going to write about them, and I don't really want to call people out on this publicly, but a lot of times the difference between a book selling well and a book just kind of being a small to middling kind of, that's an interesting idea, a scholarly book is a, I'll use an exaggerated example here that doesn't apply specifically to anybody, but pirates were Templars. Okay. Now this is a gross exaggeration because it's ludicrous actually, but if you're writing a book that pirates were Templars, and you have all this great research about Templars, but you have zero evidence that pirates in the Caribbean in 1715 were Templars, you're probably going to face pressure from your publisher to produce something to do that. So the pressure is going to be on to make that fact and then produce some evidence for it. And if you can't produce it, what you'll find, and I have found this not on this subject, but on several others, is that the evidence is just not there. The authors have just glossed right over it, and they've written it around, and you're assuming that because there's all this other research that is so well done, that this also is true. And, again, this example of if you're going to write a book about pirates or Templars, you've got to find some pirates and say, look, here, they were Templars, so it's proven right there, because that will sell the book. That little bit that's false, or that you have no evidence for, will actually make the difference in sales in the book. So there's often pressure, I think, from publishers, and I think some authors yield to it. Maybe they actually believe it, but when you start digging through this and you try to put the sources, there's another clever trick that some use. They'll actually put citations, that appear to support it, but when you actually go to those citations, there's nothing there that doesn't. I've found it sometimes that it doesn't even apply. It might apply to a minor detail in the entire paragraph and has nothing to do with the main argument. It's a cheap little trick, but I've seen it quite often. And I'm not trying to pick on people for making mistakes. These things appear to be, this is either a deliberate, they've either done this deliberately or it is a gross error of scholarship, that should not have been missed by their editors.
Yeah, I think I actually had I recently encountered that. I forget in which book it was, but they referenced ancient Sumerian piracy in the Tigris and Euphrates, and I looked up the source, and there's a full version online. There's a full PDF of the source material they used. I couldn't find a single thing about the Tigris or Euphrates.
And that's not unusual. I'm not saying it happens all the time, but it's significant enough that you're going to run across it. And again, going back to the book I'm writing, part of it is just this emphasis on, look, you have to check your sources. You don't believe everything you read. One, people make mistakes. I've made mistakes in books. I'm updating 2 PDFs right now that are probably 10,000 words apiece or more, either correcting things or in my first 2 books, See Rover's Practice and Buccaneer's Realm, and are amplifying information and new information I've learned since then. All writers make mistakes, and I'm the last person in the world to pick on a writer for making mistakes or find a paragraph that appears to be missing words, because that's happened to me because something that in the typesetting process and the editing screwed up when it went to press. So I'm not picking on writers for that, but you will find, and it's hard for a lot of writers to get away from, we're all afflicted to a certain degree with preconceived notions, and unconsciously we try to focus our research toward that, and it's very difficult to fight against that. But you're still going to find cases where it is absolutely the only conclusions you can come to are either this person just is completely screwed up the scholarship so badly that you don't know how to do it, or they did it deliberately. In other words, because they needed this conclusion to support the book and their sales. And like I said, I've seen it in a number of ways, and it's more often than not, it's in ideologically oriented areas. When you tried to take pirates in support of a political, social, or economic philosophy.
Yeah, trying to push a narrative, yeah.
And when they're doing that, it's very easy to get inclined to do that. And
yeah, that's popping up more and more.
Mistakes. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I just said that's popping up more and more for recent books. They're really starting to put in politics and social things into their histories on pirates, and it's sad to see. I usually stop reading a book when it's clear that that the author's pushing an agenda.
Yeah, piracy is filled with these. There's, some of the principal things have been Marxist economics, but then there's also, I've seen capitalist arguments pushed. I've been the pirates are really cool guys, knights at the sea. They were poor, repressed, rebels trying to make things right. There's a feminist argument on it. There's a gay argument on it. And all of these things are actually productive. I think when they're not taken to extremes, it's like anything else. But once you start, and I've actually had professors, academics who are defended by saying, well, we're trying to make people think. And my answer to that is, well, you should tell them up front that you're pushing the boundaries on this, because people read your books and they think it's all fact because you've got a PhD, when in fact, and they're really not equipped, a lot of them, to go in and check your notes. They're actually taking you at face value of believing these things. And so if you really basically making an argument, an extreme argument for argument's sake to make people think, you really should say that. Say, hey, please, let's just imagine, for example, that this happened. But that's not what they do. They present it, almost like a legal argument, which are invariably the two extremes. It's that, and stating that fact, ergo conclusion, when in fact it's a very tenuous, exaggerated argument. Berg, in his book on was it sodomy and the pirate tradition or something, if I got the name right, there is an argument. There's very little evidence of, for example, homosexuality among late 17th, early 18th century pirates, but there is one incident that, and actually Black Sails, when I was consulting with them, they actually contacted me repeatedly over this, wanting to know, could it be possible there was a don't ask, don't tell among pirates? And my answer was, possibly among some of them. We know that there's guys who did not like, they were anti-gay. We know some that probably didn't care because there was a captain so that he couldn't get elected as captain, basically. He was accused of sodomy and put in irons. He was later released after this one captain was killed in action. But this captain, his name was Cook, he went on to command other vessels, which makes the strong argument that nobody really cared, or at least a lot of these guys didn't really care that he was accused. Okay, so that's, I think, a legitimate argument, but you can't build a book around that argument.
Right.
Burke built a book pushing it to the extremes by saying that they were functioning homosexual communities, for which there is not only no evidence, but he ignored the biggest part of the evidence, which is the large numbers of prostitutes, at Tortuga and Port Royal, women prostitutes catering for the Buccaneers. And this is kind of what I was trying to talk about earlier. To push the arguments to the extreme will sell books, but it's not really getting the truth. And for me, the more fascinating truth is this it's a reflection of our modern attitude to problems that we're having with, it's one part of our modern community that is completely anti-LGBT, completely. And I suspect it was like that among these Buccaneer crews in the late 17th century. You have the guy who's going to, who says, oh, well, I think he's gay, and so I need to lock him up for political reasons, and he does it. You got other people who are completely opposed to it and said, this is BS, man. I don't know what you're doing this for. And, and the guy goes on with his life. And, so you had some people who didn't care at all, and you had some who did. To me, that's more fascinating because it's realistic. It applies to a modern culture. It applies back then. It's a very realistic look at the issues, but it won't sell a book as well as saying, hey, these guys were all gay, which scholars won't take seriously, but a lot of people will run out and buy the book.
Yeah, it's definitely got the hook.
Yeah, for the record, I'm on Captain Cook's side. Whatever, I don't care,
Yeah, it doesn't really matter.
It's the same issue with trans people serving the military. If you're willing to fight and die for your country, I go for it.
If you're able to do the job and they don't, lower standards, I don't care.
And I strongly suspect that there were pirates who had that attitude. And I know for a fact that, like this captain who put the guy in irons, there were those who had, and this guy was, by the way, today he'd be considered probably a Christian evangelical type. But anyway, the point is you had all types in there, but I don't think that, I just think that ideologies, when you start from ideology, you tend to push things to an extreme trying to make your argument rather than focusing on the very real issues. Because the book, in a lot of ways, it may bring attention to the fact that we don't know what sexuality among Buccaneers was because there's so little evidence, but it also gives you a very false impression of what the reality was. And a lot of books do this. So anyway, in some, if I had anything else to say about this, it would be follow the facts. Don't try to avoid starting out with a preconceived notion and fitting the facts to fit your preconceived conclusion. It's what we were all supposed to be taught to do at school. And I was thankfully in high school and even in college to have teachers and professors who were very adamant about fact oriented. But that's not always the case. But follow the facts. Let the facts lead you to the conclusions, and make the best conclusion you can. And it won't be perfect, and it may be disproven later. But
that's okay. You gotta go with the best available evidence.
Yeah, do what you can. Like I said, that's why I've got 20,000 words or more in revisions and new information to 2 books. Because guess what? I was wrong about some things. I actually turned out to be right about some guesses I made too, which is always a good feeling. But sometimes, you're wrong, or you find even more detail that actually makes things more interesting that you haven't found. You can't wait a century to publish a book. You go, like you said, you go with what you have and you publish it, and go from there.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, and it's going to be kind of a fun one.
Okay.
Who is your favorite pirate and why?
You're talking about favorite real pirate?
Favorite real pirate.
Absolute favorite real pirate. That's probably going to be Lawrence de Graaf. He's a Dutchman. He sailed with Spanish vessels as a gunner for a while, came to the Caribbean, was essentially a gunner aboard Spanish warships and guardacostas. He was captured by filibusters. He changed sides, served with the French, and starting out with a very small vessel, and he managed to work his way up to a 300-ton Spanish slave ship that was actually sent out to capture him, and some other pirates captured it. He was one of the co-commanders at the sack of Veracruz in 1683 and at Campeche in 1685. He was trapped. The Spanish pirate hunting armada de Barlovento ran into him right after the sack of Campeche, basically trapped him to leeward, so he couldn't get away. And having done the research, his ship was about 300 tons. It was said to have 50 more cannon, great guns. A 300-ton ship can't carry that many great guns. Just can't be done. He may have had 30 to 36. The rest were probably swivels. Arrayed against them were 2 Dutch-built Spanish warships, one of 650 tons, one of 550, basically more than twice his tonnage. 4 times his tonnage between those 2 ships. Each of them, one in the high 40s and the other in the low 50s for guns. These were actually all cannon. Large crews, including some captured pirates. They impressed the man the guns, and he fought one against these 2 all day, basically from, I think, late morning until the evening, and managed to escape. He had shot them up so badly. He was down. His ship was damaged too. He was even wounded at one point, carried below. When he heard his crew was slacking, he had himself brought back on deck. But basically, he fought 2 warships, each of which were more than twice his size, basically twice his size, and probably several times his weight in metal arrayed against him, 4 times the guns arrayed against him, and fought these guys to a standstill. And these are some of the people that you don't hear about because, we're reading the English accounts that really don't have this in there, so. But for me, he ended up being recruited by the French. They commissioned him as a naval officer, although he basically worked mostly on shore. He was later involved in defending Saint-Domingue from English invasion during 9 Years' War. Married that rich widow I mentioned. And although there's some tales that say he died in Mississippi or Alabama, he didn't. He was a brief guide to Iberville's expeditions here, but he died in 1704 on Saint-Domingue. But, probably a very harsh man in many ways. Oh, he also fought the only truly eyewitness known duel between pirate captains. It didn't last for a moment. I detail it in the book. We have Spanish eyewitness to it. So a fascinating character. Literally did all the classic things. The ex-Melling who may have met him, he probably went back in 1697 on the privateering expedition against Cartagena. may have actually met him, but he describes him as, having a big handlebar mustache, blonde hair, when you on a shore, followed around by violins and trumpets. This is very flashy. Everything you think a pirate captain is supposed to be. A guy who can fight with a sword. He was a gunner. His crews actually were really good. He could handle a ship at sea. I mean, doing all the things that we think Errol Flynn as Captain Blood or as, was it Jeffrey Thorpe or whatever could do. This guy actually is probably the closest to that. I mean, I find him far more colorful than Henry Morgan or anybody else. Just a very, very colorful character. Who served, Dutch, who'd served the Spanish and the French. And, actually divorced his wife. He was married, had a wife in the Canary Islands. He divorced her to marry the widow. Nice guy. Hey, this woman's got money.
Yeah, gotta have class.
Yeah, you gotta move up in society, I guess. And again, this goes back. It's very modern in a lot of ways. If you think about it, it's the same vices and problems that people do today.
Yeah, definitely. I think my favorite pirate would definitely be Henry Avery. I just like how cunning, I guess he is. Like, he's just clever. Like, I don't know. I just find it really.
He never got caught.
Yeah, exactly. It was
come ashore in Ireland. I think he ran off with somebody else's wife, if you read the accounts, or at least it appears that way. Yet somebody else's wife was with him. I think it was with Avery. But anyway, it's the guy who just disappears, with this money.
Yeah, and I liked, I think from some accounts, like, yeah, I'm pretty sure he, and maybe this is just like me getting like an image of him from the stuff I've read and just trying to picture what he'd be like, but I feel like he'd probably know that he would be caught soon, so he told everybody he was going to a different place. Like, he told one guy he was going to Ireland, one guy who was going to Greenland, somebody else who's going some other place, and so no matter who they caught, they wouldn't actually have any real leads, or they wouldn't know which one was true. It's just, I don't know, I just thought it was great.
And I know that if we have just a lot of people, probably from reading too much historically incorrect historical fiction, I know I went through this in an editing process for that first novel, is that what you're saying he did was not as easy to do as people think they do. We've got a false idea from, like I said, bad historical fiction and TV shows that, 3 centuries ago you could just disappear in society. You couldn't. People were nosy. They wanted to know where you were from. They would check things out. When Avery's crew came ashore in Ireland, people were like, whoa, these guys have silver. They're paying a fortune for these cheap horses and stuff. These guys have to be pirates, or maybe some of the assassins who tried to kill William III. So people immediately knew. They were contacting authorities, and these guys didn't have very long before they had to, disperse. And trust me, when you get out in the country, I don't care whether it's, I'm talking like the countryside or in the south of the country, people ask questions. They know who their neighbors are. They know when there's strangers in town, and it wasn't as easy to disappear. So the fact that he could have disappeared, he would have had to have disappeared somewhere. Probably, I don't know. I'm speculating. It certainly would have been easier in large cities, but it really wasn't as easy as we think it was. You didn't just put on a false personality, and people accepted it. You needed backstory and everything else. So what you're complimenting on, I think, is very, very sophisticated. He had to have been a bright guy to have gotten away with that. He just disappeared.
Yeah, I mean that's why he's definitely my favorite pirate. I think that's all the questions I have for you. And then I guess this part of the show is just called Shameless Plugs. You get to plug whatever you want and just go bananas on marketing right now.
Oh, yeah, marketing is not my forte. When it comes to it, I've always been, and my wife gets on me all the time about it. It's just, hey, it's a good book. Go ahead and pick one of the books and read them. She's like, no, you have to plug your, I had years ago somebody asked me, told me I needed a brand, and what's my brand? And I said, brands for cattle. So that kind of gives you my take on marketing in a lot of ways. But pick any of the books. I'm working on a sequel to Fortune's Wealth of Fiction, if you like accurate historical fiction set in the late 17th century. I'm sorry the first volume doesn't get to the Caribbean yet, but I actually broke it down from a massively overlong first novel, separated into 3 novels. If you want to know the truth behind a lot of pirate myths, read the recent book. If you really want to know how pirates actually fought, and it's not just pirates, publishers basically dictate titles, and nobody's ever changed my principal title recently, but they always change the subtitles, and pirates sells. But Sea Rover's practice is really about pirates and privateers and commerce raiding naval vessels. Anybody who was plundering ships at sea in the late 17th, early 18th century, it's a book about their legitimate tactics. Don't just look at the first chapter and go, oh, this historical background is not about tactics, as one person told me he did. No, the book is actually about tactics, from front to back. If you want to know what buccaneers lived like in the late 17th century, there's the Buccaneers Realm. If you just want realistic narrative fiction, you can try oh my God, the title is so long. This title I did not pick. How History's Greatest Pirates Pillaged, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, we could talk about marketing sometime about that, some stories on that. We don't have time here, but those are just kind of some narrative fiction stories, I guess, that are fun or should be fun to read. And if you're really interested in maritime history from antiquity and prehistory all the way to the present, that's pirate hunting. It's literally a survey of sea roving, whether it's piracy, privateering, or naval commerce raiding, but looked at from the point of view of pirate hunters and from its victims, from how you actually would have hunted these people down and suppressed it, which, with my naval background, is really, in a lot of ways, the orientation I would have had toward that. Our orientation is, these are not good guys, how do we stop them? Then I guess that's it. Hopefully I will, in a few months, have the sequel, the manuscript to the publisher for the novel. So we'll see how that goes. Like I said, 13-month-old son, along with a couple of grown daughters, and it's really slowed down the production of written material.
All right, well, I will definitely be sure to pre-order the book. I'm assuming it'd be on Amazon, right?
Yes, I think most of these you should be able to. Most are still in print, and I think all are available on Amazon. Buccaneers Realm, I'm not so sure. I know there are hard copies available. It might not be in print on there, except maybe it's an ebook. Probably is an ebook on there, but everything else should be either hard or soft cover on Amazon. You occasionally find them in the latest book should be in a lot of the brick and mortar stores as well, at least for a while.
And we can definitely find you and follow you and your exploits on BenersonLittle.com.
That I have this Facebook page as well. I'm afraid I don't do a lot with Twitter, and I've actually started doing. I never did much with it, and the way Twitter's being used lately, I won't go into politics here, but it's made me in a lot of ways less inclined to use Twitter. So don't follow me on. You can follow me on Twitter, but it may be weeks or months before you ever see it. So, but yeah, there's a Facebook author page, and there's also the web page. So.
All right. Well, I would definitely like to say that this was a great talk. I love talking to you, man. It was awesome.
I enjoyed it very, very much. It's nice to have legitimate questions and seriously a platform where you can actually make legitimate answers and have a legitimate conversation, which is we need to do more of these days. Oh, and by the way, if anybody has questions, they read a book, they disagree with something, you guys are welcome to email me and say, hey, I don't think you appropriately cited this. I promise you, I will get back to you on it. And if you find errors, please let me know. I will fix them. So.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for watching. And if you did like the video, make sure you subscribe. And if you really love us, make sure you check us out and support us on Patreon, because I want to keep bringing you guys the best content, but that is always getting harder and harder. So you do you guys. You have a good one. We'll see you next time.